Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey y'all, welcome to the show. It's Mallory Murphy. I'm here with co-host Katie Burke. How are you today, Katie?
I'm good, Mallory. How are you?
Doing great. And today we are sitting in for Chris and Mike, and we're going to explore the crazy, wacky, wonderful world of decoy carving.
We sure are. And we have an extremely talented guest, Master Carver, Marty Hanson. How are you, Marty?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Been a full-time decoy maker all my life. Started when I was in my early teens. Worked at a gun club for years and ended up with one of my customers at the gun club wanting some decoys for a club that they ran out in western Minnesota. And I ended up quitting the gun club and working for him. And this is where we are right now. So I think it was probably 13 or 14 when I started that job for him. Worked for him for, 15, 20 years making decoys for him, solely for him. I didn't do shows or anything. I didn't even really know there was shows at that point. That was still when I lived in Minnesota. So, it's kind of strange how it happened, but it's turned into a full-time occupation since I was 13, 14 years old.
So when did you decide that you wanted to turn your passion into an actual profession?
Well, it's kind of a strange evolution because, I started so early as a kid, and living at home and whatnot. You don't have bills and you don't have, the responsibilities that you do if you're on your own. So, it was kind of a hobby. It was a good way for me to make money at the time as a kid, be employed. And then when I went to college for a year and a half, 2 years, and found out that wasn't for me and kept making decoys just through that period. But it wasn't like an actual day that I said this was going to happen. It just happened over time. At one point, I went to a gallery that was local in Edina, Minnesota. Pretty famous gallery called Wild Wings. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. I'm not sure if it's in business anymore or not. But there was a good old guy there named Jerry Epple who ran that. I think Byron Webster and Jerry Epple ran the Edina shop at that time, and I was living in South Minneapolis and at the time had a shop in my basement, and I went and brought 2 decoys to Jerry and says, yeah, I'll take those from you. So he bought them from me. And that's kind of where it started. It's like, well, that was easy. I made more today than I made, all the last 2 weeks, so it kind of, okay, now I'll find another gallery. Then I went to another gallery and, they bought a couple. And then I also had this gentleman named Bob Lindstrom, who was the guy that got me started, who had the duck club. So I was working for him still and then supplementing through these galleries and stuff like that. So I guess to answer your question, there wasn't really a day that I just said, oh yeah, this is it. It was kind of a long-term thing.
Go ahead and kind of explain to our listeners what exactly contemporary decoys are. Well,
contemporary is a strange word in the fact that, every decoy maker was a contemporary at one point. Elmer Kroll, Lem Ward, you name it, they were all contemporary. Contemporary to me just means in the modern day. So obviously right now we're all, contemporary carvers, anybody that's making decoys today. 75 to 100 years from now, that won't be the case. We won't be contemporary carvers. I think contemporary basically means new to me. It means in the moment, now, modern, new. But, the Ward brothers carved for a long time and they were contemporary for, 60 years. So I think it has to also do maybe when somebody passes that you're obviously not contemporary anymore.
Right. And then there's some that it's kind of like weird because like Schmiedlin, some people still consider him contemporary, but he's obviously not with us anymore. So I don't know.
You know what, Katie, that's a really good point because, I still consider him contemporary, I guess, because we're still living in that time. It's a really hard thing to pin down, and that's a really good point to make. Because Jim's stuff is still contemporary. Jim and I made decoys at the same time in same time period in time, and I agree with that.
Yeah, it's a confusing definition.
Right. It is. But I think contemporary, the connotation right now for contemporary is people that are making decoys right now. You could jump online or give a phone call and this guy's contemporary is making stuff right now.
Yeah. You can get a commission if you wanted.
Well, and I think also contemporary, what we kind of contemporary, when we do our show in Minnesota, we have our vintage classes, and everything that's entered in these classes to be considered antique in our show has to be older than 50 years.
Okay.
If that helps, so it's got to be 50 years or older. Because when I started, doing the shows, which was late, and I'd made decoys for 10 or 15 years before I ever did a show. And the first shows were, in the early 80s for me. Ben Schmidt just died 15 years ago. So Ben Schmidt's an old carver from Michigan. He did stuff in the early 1900s and later. His decoys would have been contemporary because, if it was 1980 for me, he did stuff in the, 40s, 50s.
Right.
So he would have been a contemporary, but now he's not.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a tough thing to put a pin on.
Right.
Yeah. Katie and I were talking earlier about how the motion and movement of your decoys on the water are unlike any other. Explain to us your design process. How do you go from inspiration to actual working decoy? Because you hunt over your decoys. You don't make just art.
Yeah, I would say 20 to 25% of the birds that I make for anybody are being used. They're specialty type items for guys. They're not inexpensive, and guys that just love the sport, they've got their fancy double barrel or their, fancy duck club or all that stuff. They kind of like to, keep with the tradition. But as far as the inspiration comes, putting a bunch of decoys on the water, it's neat to have everything in a different position if you can, and there's two types of motion. To me, it's in motion and frozen motion. Frozen motion would be like people see pictures of a preening duck. Well, that's a frozen motion. A duck doesn't hold that position. That's a motion in time that's just shot at that one moment. Now, a swimming pose, that shows motion, but it's constant because that duck's swimming forward. So I think you really have to be careful on what you make as a decoy maker, whether it's a frozen in time motion or actual motion.
Do you know, like at this point, you've been carving so long, do you just know kind of how it's going to move on the water? And if so, when did you learn that? And like, how do you figure that out?
I guess you never know until you try, but I've been making decoys for so long that you learn what looks good and what doesn't on the water. One example I had, is kind of funny. One of my earlier dogs, Cedar 1, I call her. I've got a Cedar 2 now. That's why I call her Cedar 1, obviously. But I made some swimming mallards, and I still own them today, where the head was real, real low on the water. And it was like stretched out swimming. Well, I'd shot in so many ducks with her in Illinois with a friend of mine, Jerry Cranwell. And we had shot so many ducks that year. We traveled all over. My other friend, Marty Dahl, and Jerry Cranwell, we traveled all over, hunted ducks. Well, she would see this stretched out neck mallard and always think it was the one trying to get out of the decoys after it'd been crippled. And she would always go up to that duck and bump it because she thought that was the one that was trying to swim out because the neck was so low, how you have a cripple, and their neck will be on the water and they'll be moving out. So, I mean, that's how I guess those experiences make you change the motions and the things that you want on a decoy. I've also made decoys that when I got done with them, it was like a frozen motion. They looked like they were dying on the water. They were terrible. The head's back and the bill's up. It doesn't look right. It looks like it was sick to start with. So obviously you scratch that off the board, but you learn over time, and I've always hunted over my own things. So, and other carvers. I've always liked to try to buy decoys from other makers too. So, you can see what they do and that. So, but you learn over time.
Yeah, that makes your story about Cedar makes me laugh because, like, you always see in the live decoys like they used to use. Yeah, and I was just like, what does the dog do in that situation? Like, does it know? Like, I never got that.
Well, I would bet at the first time yeah, the dog didn't probably know, but I bet you afterwards, dogs are pretty smart. I bet you afterwards the dog would, just say, yeah, whatever,
Do you have a favorite species that you love to carve, or do you just wake up that morning and it's like, hey, I'm going to do this, or hey, somebody commissioned me to do this? So
canvasbacks are probably my favorite. They're one of the most desired ducks, I guess. When you get a few of them in your boat after you've shot a few, it's a nicer bag than, having a gadwall and a mallard to me. But canvasbacks I've made probably more of than anything. And I would honestly say that when I get inspired to build 6 decoys or 1 decoy or whatever, I've got it in my head at that moment. That's kind of my favorite duck at that moment. The one I'm working on at the time, because that's where you're totally into that. You're totally focused on that one thing. Blue-winged teal and loons are my least favorite. So.
Oh, no blue wings. Yeah. I'm gonna order some. How long does it usually take you to make one?
You can do a basic hunting decoy. I can probably do one of those in 8 hours, if pretty easily.
What about one that I want to sit on a shelf?
Those type of birds which is 80% of my clientele right now. It's 20 hours and up.
Oh wow!
And it really depends on how much detail somebody wants into something, how much paint they want on something, what position they want. The complication of positions changes price and cost just because it takes time. If somebody wants something super special, then that's time and extra. A lot of it's involved in the design process. I don't use any patterns twice ever. I mean, I've got boxes of patterns that are stacked to the ceiling. I just, after I carve something, it's done. I'm over it, so I've got to make something new and try to make something better. No, that's with the exception of somebody orders 6 decoys or a dozen decoys. I'll make 1 or 2 patterns, and alter them and work off that same pattern so that whole group matches.
So you're trying to make it hard for the collectors in 200 years to figure out which one yours are, huh?
I hope not.
So that leads us to, are you still learning, or do you feel like you have your craft mastered, or do you have anything that actually challenges you?
I'm always learning. The minute you say that you've kind of mastered everything, it's kind of over for me. I'm confident. I know I can make anything I want to make. But I'm always learning. I mean, every day, even the littlest things, whether it's painting or carving, you're constantly learning. I mean, but there was a point, in the last 10 years, I physically know that if, I have to make a different piece, if somebody needed a deer head carved, or I've been doing eagles or dead hanging waterfall. I'm not put off by any of that anymore. Whereas of 25 years ago, it would have been a head scratcher.
Do you have any notable clientele that you sell to, or can you dish on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, nobody that I feel free to mention, but there's some significant people out in the West Coast, Microsoft guys, and there's a club out in the West Coast, a really good friend of mine who passed away owns, and his wife's running it now, and we have a lot of fun out there. There's some people, but not, I guess nobody that I can just say, when you buy something, it's kind of up to them to say what they want to say about it. So
what do you think sets your craftsmanship apart from others that are doing the same thing that you're doing right now?
I guess there's several things maybe that would, that might come up. I mean, I guess one of the big things that's maybe kind of unique is when I started, we didn't have internet. We were on a party line in the rural parts of Minnesota as far as a phone. You didn't have really magazines even. You maybe had Ducks Unlimited as probably 90% of my reference when I started, because there's a picture of ducks there. There was only a few guys that did books on carving or actual pictures of live birds. You had to go out and photograph stuff yourself and learn. And I guess being in that situation as a kid till the time I was probably 22 or so, you kind of lived in a vacuum. So you had to kind of develop your own style. You couldn't look on the internet and see what somebody else was making and say, oh, I like that. not necessarily copy it, but I'm going to, take that aspect of this person's carving and use it. So I kind of developed my own style. And to be honest with you, for the first 10 years, it never changed. It's really, really unusual because it never changed. And they were pretty crude. Every now and then I would try to do something a little bit better. But until I started, going to the shows in Davenport in the early 80s in Davenport, Iowa, and I competed in a few shows for 8-10 years, that's when you really started to learn. But I guess that's one of the things is a lot of these guys nowadays don't have the time to develop their own style because there's just too much information out there. And I think they get sidetracked by trying to make one like this guy or make one like that guy and not be unique to themselves. I guess the other part is what I would say sets, what I do apart is everything is handmade and handmade methods and materials. I don't use any power tools. I use a bandsaw. After that, it's spoke shaves, draw knives, all traditional tools, traditional paints. I study and I deal in antique decoys also, and I also collect. So I'm able to handle some of the better things that were ever made in the last 150 years. And you learn from those things, as far as construction and what works and what didn't, because they've stood the test of time. And I guess being in it for 45 years, I guess, as a full occupation, I guess that's something that maybe I would look at.
Well, I would say another thing that's unique about you is, a lot of carvers, at least they learn from somebody in the area or, kind of got to have a mentorship. And you didn't really have that when you came up, right? You kind of did it on your own.
Yeah. It was kind of thrown on me. Actually, yes. But I do have to give credit where credit's due. I was so young that I didn't have a driver's license or a bandsaw. And the first few decoys that I made was, I had to go cut out at a local guy's place. He was an hour away and he was building this part of this big rig for this gentleman, Bob Lindstrom. And, he was kind of just make one or two at a time and he wasn't getting the product done. So basically I kind of took his work at that point, because I made probably 5,000 decoys for this guy at the end of our relationship. So I had a little bit of outside influence, but I mean, he was an hour and a half away. So it wasn't like he was standing right there, and
right.
Bob Lindstrom, the owner of the club and the duck hunter, had his idea what he wanted of a decoy. He didn't know how to make it. He didn't know how to paint. He knew nothing, but he said, no, I want this like this and this like, so I guess the first 10 years of my carving, I was just there to please his preferences, what he wanted. I was just there to, fulfill what he wanted with these things.
I know you've told this story before, but it's such a good story. So can you tell us the story about how when Bob Lindstrom gave you your first job?
Yeah, I was working at the gun club since I was probably 12, 13 years old, Minneapolis Gun Club. It's located in Prior Lake. It's a pretty famous gun club in the state of Minnesota. And, it was a great job and I enjoyed being out there. I shot registered trap for years as a junior and knew all the people, traveled with a lot of the people, shooting events and whatnot. And they had a league night at the duck tower, which I always liked working was the duck tower because it was a different group of guys that shot that versus trap or skeet. So Bob and his group, they were all Harley guys. They all were big bikers, I mean, like big bikers back in the late 70s, early 80s were different bikers now. They weren't the lawyer types, and these guys were real bikers. And he says, "You want to quit working here?" Because he'd always noticed on my sketch pads I'd be drawing like bluebill heads and flying ducks on his score sheet. And he says, "Can you think you can carve a decoy?" I says, "Yeah, I have been carving a couple decoys. I'd probably made 8 or 9 things in my life previous to that." He says, "All right." He says, "Well," I don't have any saw or anything. I don't have any, I'm not living at my dad's house. I don't really have a workshop. The workshop was my bedroom." So a week later with it, he didn't say a word. He had a full semi deliver a truckload of red cedar, 4x10 red cedar, and a brand new bandsaw in the box. Dropped right off in the middle of the driveway of the house, right behind my dad's car.
What did your parents say?
Oh, right behind my dad's car. My dad was a teacher in Minneapolis, and he had to get to work, and he couldn't get his car out because there was a ton of wood. I mean, a semi load of wood, not 10 sticks. I'm talking a lot. And he was mad, but he wasn't. But it wasn't put in the right spot of the driveway. That's for sure. So that's how it started. Yeah, that's how it started. Put that saw together, and Dad said I could have the basement or the garage and put all that stuff together. And even at one point, my dad was cutting stuff out for me because I had to turn out so many things. He'd spend 2-3 hours in the saw cutting out, and then I'd finish them, carve them.
You still have one, right? Or one of the early ones?
Yeah, we've got several. Actually, I've got several, and I mean, they trade on the internet and all over the place. I see them all the time. Back then I was getting $25-$30 a piece for them. And they sell now for $200 to $300. It kind of makes me cringe because I look at them and just go, "Oh my God, those are bad." But they weren't made for the collector shelf. They were made to hunt over. I mean, he'd set out 500 to 600 decoys at a time.
But you were also, 14, 15 years old. I mean, I painted when I was 14 and 15 years old. My parents have it hanging on their walls. I don't want to look at it, but they love it.
I know. Yeah, it's all in the eye, I guess. Yeah, it's all however which way you look at it. These guys, they just love those ducks, because they're more reasonable, and I made them when I was in my teens. The collectors that got them, and they think they're great. And I just look at them and just go, "Oh my God!" I wish all of these could just go away. But I also think it helps new collectors get into something at entry level and start, and then maybe want something better or want to see the progression of a carver. So I think that's kind of cool too. So
speaking of that, where do you see the future of traditional decoy carving go from here? Where do you see the future of Hanson decoys?
As far as traditional decoy making, I think it's getting astray a little bit just due to a lot of the modern methods that people are, when you say traditional, I mean, I'm talking about hand tools, oil paints, traditional methods, not using a lot of filler in these decoys. If you've got a flaw in a decoy, it's just as easy to make a wood patch than it is to put filler in it and have the filler fall out in 2 years after it's gotten wet a couple times. So I guess traditional, I'm real stringent on the word traditional to me. I mean, it's a real fine, direct line. I guess handling old decoys and collecting old decoys really helps the tradition aspect of it and maintaining that. There's only a handful of makers, as far as I'm concerned, that are doing it traditionally, and as long as they can keep showing people how to do it, and it's real tough because a lot of these guys don't want to share things either, so it's tough to pass on a tradition when you're doing this for a living, it's a hard thing to do, but I think that's the future. Needs to know how to use these tools, my friend Sean Sutton is making spoke shaves now. So, he's taken it past their tradition to making the tools that do the, traditional decoys, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
So the future is great, with rising prices of these old decoys that are getting higher and higher and out of reach for people. I'm finding the new customers, the younger generation, such as yourselves, they don't like the rough old worn stuff anymore. They like new.
I don't know if it's that. It's just that I can't afford it.
We can't afford the old stuff.
Well, yes, you can. Yeah, you can. You can start somewhere. But I think a lot of it is you buy from a contemporary maker. You know what you're going to get. It's not fake. You know who made it. You can talk to the person. And I think it's a different experience than buying a $1,000 old decoy that's went through 35 hands. It's cool, but you really don't have any closeness to it,
mm-hmm.
Right?
Other than the aesthetic value that you see at the time.
You mentioned a minute ago your friendship with Other Carvers. How does that influence their work, influence your work, and does it?
It does in a very slight way. There's lots of things that it might be a tone of color of paint, or it might be an angle of tail set or something. I really kind of believe to that every carver should do his own thing and not work off somebody else's patterns, and be individuals. When I used to judge, in Sacramento at all the other shows, and I'm still, out in Washington, the toughest thing is there's 10 bluebills in a judging tank. You can tell the pattern that they use. It's all the same pattern. All those ducks look the same. There's no individuality. And I tend to lean towards the individuality versus the, carve for a specific judge. So as far as influences go, I think influences can be great, and I think they can hurt you. I see a lot of guys making stuff by other makers, making things very similar to what other makers are making because they have their distinct style. And I think, come on, it might be fun to try to do it, do it once, but you really need to do your own thing. And I'm guilty of it. I make some old looking birds too, based off the old things, but I generally do that for a breakaway from what I do. It's fun to do. The patterns, the easiest day I have in the shop is making an old time swan or shorebird because the pattern's already done for you. The idea's already there. You just got to mimic it. It's a different work experience at that point when you're making something to emulate another thing versus creating your own design and your own pattern and working that through to the end. I'm
obviously a female, and with females, you often get a little bit of drama. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Have you ever had anyone make a decoy and try to pawn it off as one of yours?
I've had a couple instances where the initials were MH on the bottom of a decoy and they were sold as mine. Yes. But, I don't think it was intentional. I think, the initials are there, it must be him. And, and the seller, usually an auction house or a dealer, just assume that, and I've had to tell, a lot of people I never made that, I think I know a couple of friends of mine, decoy makers that are well known. I know they've had that issue. I've had people copy designs, which is kind of flattering at one point, but then it's not. It kind of makes you mad.
Can you copyright that, your pattern? How does that work?
I don't think you can because everything's original. I don't think you can. It's, it's a age old deal. Look at some of the old makers. Some of them, you can't tell them apart half the time, so.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It just goes with the deal, I would hope the general public and the decoy buying market would know who designed that first. I just hope they would understand who made it first. And I think it maybe does the carver that emulated the bird less benefit than good.
On the subject of that, tell our listeners how we can go about purchasing one of your decoys.
Basically, I'm online on Facebook quite a bit. So, I've got a lot of connections through that, which is, changing times, obviously. Didn't used to have that, 10 years ago. Back in 2000 to 2008, I had a website which worked good until everything crashed in 2008. And then I kind of shut that website down. Right now, basically, I'm on a commission basis. I do 4 or 5 shows a year. I try to hold inventory for those shows that haven't been inventory that hasn't been spoken for previously. I don't like going to a show and bringing 10 things that are already spoken for, and having people come up. Well, I'll take that. Well, no, it's sold. That's just not the way. I try to have 4 to 10 things available for purchase at a show that weren't commissioned by people. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is give me a call at the house or at the shop here. The other way is what we were just talking about with those old ducks that I made is secondary market. There's a lot of secondary market birds. I see that come up. People, change directions or they pass away or whatever. And I know John Dieter and Gary Guyette have quite a few coming up in the next auction from a gentleman that's passed. So that's another one, but you're buying from the second, third owner. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes you can get a real good deal on something, and sometimes you're going to, every time it changes hands, it's going to increase in cost. Best way, if you're interested, just give me a holler here at the shop. That's the best way. And we put you on the list and we do what we can. So
it is harvest time down here in Memphis. And when the crop comes in, I'm going to beg my dad and my husband if I can buy one.
All right. You'll be first on the list.
Awesome. And I'm going to order a blue wing.
It won't even be blue wing season.
No loons.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Marty, for coming on the show and talking to us today.
You bet. Great talking to you, ladies.
Special thanks to our guest, Marty Hanson of Hanson Decoys. I want to thank my co-host, Katie Burt, for always making sure that I don't act a fool. And special thanks to our producer, Clay Baird, for knocking every single show out. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.